Lena Ford had never been afraid of big rooms. She had grown up in a small flat above a repair shop in northern England, where the ceiling was so low her father had to duck through the doorway. She had worked her way through every level of the Earth Space Assembly, from junior analyst to fleet coordinator to the woman standing here now, in the largest room she had ever seen in her life, about to speak on behalf of every human being alive. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was not a room that made people feel welcome. The ceiling disappeared into a soft blue haze so far above her head that she could not tell where it ended. The tiers rose in a wide curve around the central floor, each one higher than the last, filled with beings of 11 different species. Some had 4 arms. Some had no arms at all. Some breathed through membranes along their necks that opened and closed like slow mouths. They were all watching her. None of them leaned forward with interest. They watched her the way people watch something they have already decided about. Lena stepped up to the center podium. It was made for a taller species and the speaking surface came up to her chin. She did not ask for it to be adjusted. She stood straight, placed her notes flat on the surface, and looked up at the tiers. High Arbiter Sarek sat at the highest point of the council, in a seat that was wider and darker than the rest. He was tall even sitting down, with pale scaled skin and yellow eyes that caught the light strangely. He had not moved since she entered the hall. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, but the closest human word for it was patient. The way a person is patient when they are waiting for something small to finish. Lena began to speak. She had written the speech herself. She had rewritten it 9 times over 4 months, cutting words, adding facts, adjusting the tone from confident to careful to something in between. She spoke about humanity's history in space. She spoke about the 9 worlds they had settled, the trade routes they had opened, the medical research they had shared freely with 3 species who had not yet asked. She spoke about the border monitoring program humanity had been running for 2 years at their own cost, watching the outer edges of charted space for threats the Council had not yet noticed. She kept her voice steady. She made eye contact with different parts of the tiers. She spoke for 12 minutes exactly. When she stopped, the hall was quiet. Sarek looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Commander Ford," he said. His voice carried easily through the hall without any device to help it. It was a deep voice, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never once been rushed in his life. Humanity has existed in space for less than 300 years. "That is correct," Lena said. "You have settled 9 worlds," he continued. "By our count, 4 of those settlements are still classified as unstable. You have lost 2 deep space vessels to simple navigation errors in the last 40 years. Your population across all worlds is under 60 billion, which places you among the smallest of the observed species." He paused. "You have no standing fleet. You have no unified defense structure that meets our minimum standard. You have been in contact with Council space for less than 80 years. Lena said nothing. She had expected all of this. "You are, by every measure we apply," Sarek said, "an infant species." Something moved through the hall then. It was not laughter exactly. It was softer than that and somehow worse. It was the sound of a very large room full of very old beings all quietly agreeing with something at the same time. Some of them shifted in their seats. One representative near the lower tier made a sound like air being let slowly out of something. Another turned to the being beside them and exchanged a few quiet words. Lena kept her hands flat on the podium. She kept her eyes on Sarek. He called the vote. A small display on the council table lit up. The votes came in one by one, fast, no hesitation from anyone. When it was done, the display showed 11 marks, all the same color, all meaning the same thing. Not one in favor. "The petition is rejected," Sarek said. "Humanity remains under observed species status. You are not eligible to resubmit for a period of no less than 50 years. He was already looking down at something on his table, moving on to the next matter. You may be escorted back to your transport at your convenience, Commander. Lena picked up her notes from the podium. She folded them once and put them in her coat pocket. She walked down from the podium and crossed the wide open floor of the hall, her footsteps quiet on the dark stone surface. She reached the long bench along the observer's wall, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. A small insectoid aide named Veen, who managed the council's daily schedule and had been watching from the side of the hall, skittered over to her quietly and held out a cup of water. He did not say anything. He simply held it out. It seemed like something close to kindness. Lena took the cup and drank slowly. An attendant appeared at her shoulder a moment later and spoke in a low voice. Commander, your transport can be ready within the hour. We can arrange your departure whenever you are ready. Thank you, Lena said. She did not stand up. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes forward and she waited. She had been told to wait. Someone back on Earth, someone who had known this vote would go exactly this way, had told her very clearly before she left. Stay in the room, Lena. Whatever happens, do not leave that room. So she stayed. The hall had moved on without her. Sarek was deep into the next agenda item, something about trade route fees along the third corridor, and the council representatives were talking among themselves the way people talk when the difficult part of the day is already behind them. No one looked at the observer's bench. No one looked at Lena. She sat still and watched the room and drank her water slowly. Veen had returned to his post near the side wall, his 6 thin legs arranged neatly beneath him, his small compound eyes occasionally flicking toward her with something that might have been curiosity. He was the only one in the room who seemed to remember she was still there. 40 minutes passed. Then 50. Lena had just finished the last of her water when she heard it. It started below her feet. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, a low vibration that moved up through the stone floor and into the bench and into her bones. She felt it before she heard it. Then the hearing came, a tone, rising, sharp, coming from somewhere deep in the station below the hall. An alarm. Not a drill tone. She had heard enough of both in her years with the Earth Space Assembly to know the difference immediately. The council chamber went quiet mid-sentence. Then 3 things happened very fast. The large display panels along the upper wall of the hall, which had been showing trade route charts, switched without warning to a tactical map of the outer border. The map was detailed, green with marked positions, dozens of small lights indicating fleet positions. Then the lights began to go out. Not all at once. 1, then another, then 3 together, then a cluster of them, then the rest in a rapid sequence that lasted no more than a few seconds. When it stopped, 42 green markers were dark. At almost the same moment, Veen moved. He crossed the hall floor faster than Lena had thought his small legs could carry him, reached her bench, and stood in front of her with 2 of his 6 arms raised and his voice tight and quick. You are asked to come, he said. He did not say please. He did not explain. He turned and moved toward the side corridor and Lena stood and followed him without a word. The war room was 2 levels below the grand hall, reached by a passage so narrow that Lena had to turn slightly sideways to move through it quickly. She could hear the noise before the door opened, voices overlapping, the sharp sounds of equipment being activated, someone repeating a sequence of numbers in a flat urgent tone that suggested they had already said it 3 times and were going to keep saying it. The door opened and the noise hit her fully. The war room was circular and wide, with a central table that projected a live tactical map above its surface. Around the table stood officers from 4 different species, all talking at once, all looking at the same map. The 42 dark markers hung in the air above the table like something that should not be possible. Fleet Admiral Dora stood closest to the table. He was broad and gray-skinned with 4 arms, 2 of which were pressed flat against the table and 2 of which were moving across control panels rapidly. He was the largest being in the room and also the most still in the face, which told Lena he was the most afraid. Sarek stood to the right of the table. He was not moving at all. No one told Lena to leave. She walked to the edge of the table and looked at the map. Patrol Group 7, Dora said, not to her specifically, to anyone near him who was listening. Border corridor, outer edge of charted space. Standard rotation, 42 vessels, full crew complement. He touched a section of the table and the map shifted, zooming toward the dark area. They sent a standard distress ping at 1442. Then silence. All of them. In how long? Lena said. Dora looked at her. He seemed to decide quickly that there was no point in not answering. 2 minutes and 50 seconds, he said. The room had moments of people trying to explain it. One officer said interference. Another said a weapon they had not seen before. A third said cascade failure, which no one believed because cascade failures did not happen to 42 separate ships in 3 minutes with no debris and no signal. Veen appeared at Lena's shoulder. No explosion signatures, he said quietly, speaking just to her. We have a debris detection array across that corridor. It recorded nothing. No heat burst, no shockwave, no fragments. He paused. They are simply gone. Lena stared at the dark markers. She had seen a report 4 months ago. An unmanned human probe sent along a parallel corridor, part of a quiet monitoring program that Earth ran without telling anyone. The probe had sent back 6 seconds of strange data and then gone silent. The report had been marked as equipment failure and filed away by someone who did not know what they were looking at. Lena had known what they were looking at. She had told someone. That someone had told someone else. And a quiet set of instructions had been put in place, which was why she had been told to stay in the room no matter what happened. Sarek turned from the map and looked at her. It was not the look from the hall. The look in the hall had been the look of a man watching something small and unimportant finish speaking. This look was different. This was the look of someone standing in a burning building who has just noticed that the person beside them is not afraid. Your species, he said slowly. You patrol near that corridor. We do, Lena said. Have you seen anything? Lena looked at the 42 dark markers floating above the table. She looked at Dora. She looked at the officers around the room who had all gone quiet and were now watching her. Then she looked back at Sarek. I need to make a call, she said. The call lasted 4 minutes. Lena made it from a small side room off the war room corridor, a storage space really, with metal shelving along one wall and a single overhead light that flickered once when she closed the door. She used her personal communicator, not the station system. She spoke quietly and listened more than she talked. When she came back out, her face was the same as it always was, calm, unhurried, giving nothing away. Sarek was waiting in the corridor. He had followed her out of the war room without explaining himself to anyone inside it, which told her that whatever authority he normally carried in that room, right now he wanted to be somewhere quieter. Come with me, Lena said. She did not wait to see if he would follow. She walked. The station's lower levels were a different world from the grand hall above. The ceilings were lower, the lighting was a dull yellow, and the corridors smelled of fuel and processed air. They passed through 2 security checkpoints where the guards looked at Sarek and stepped aside immediately. They passed a row of docking bay windows that looked out onto the dark body of the station's outer hull. At the 4th window Lena stopped and pointed. The ship attached to the docking arm below looked exactly like what its registration said it was. A mid-range cargo hauler, broad across the middle, worn at the edges, with the kind of dents and paint scrapes that come from years of moving between colonies. The name on the hull was faded but readable. The Meridian. It sat in its berth the way tired working ships always sit, heavy and quiet and utterly unremarkable. That is yours, Sarek said. It was not quite a question. That is ours, Lena said. They took the lift down to the docking level. The bay door opened and the smell changed again, metal and cool dry air and something faintly electrical underneath it all. A short man with gray hair and a worn jacket was standing at the base of the Meridian's entry ramp. He had his arms crossed and he was looking at Lena the way someone looks at a person they have been waiting for. "Captain Will Hart," Lena said to Sarek. Then to Hart, "We are going inside." Hart looked at Sarek for exactly 1 second. Then he turned and walked up the ramp without a word. The inside of the Meridian looked like a cargo ship. The main bay was stacked with sealed containers, gray and brown and marked with standard shipping codes. Grain. Medical supplies. Industrial parts. Everything exactly as the manifest said. Sarek moved slowly through the bay, looking at the containers, looking at the walls, looking at the low ceiling with its ordinary lights and ordinary pipes. "I do not understand why you have brought me here," he said. Lena walked to the far wall of the bay. She pressed her hand flat against a panel that looked like every other panel on the wall, plain gray metal, nothing to notice. There was a soft click. Then the panel moved, swinging inward, and behind it was another panel, and she pressed that one too, and it slid sideways, and behind that one was a space that the Meridian's official design drawings did not mention at all. Sarek stepped forward and looked. The space ran the full length of the ship's inner wall. It was not large but it was organized with great care. Racks of equipment were fixed to the inner frame, each one secured tightly against the movement of travel. There were long dark instruments that Sarek did not recognize, compact and dense, clearly designed to do a great deal in a small space. There were drive components that did not match the ship's registered engine class. There were sensor arrays folded flat against the wall that would, when deployed, cover a range that no cargo ship had any reason to cover. There were other things further back in the space that were not for looking or listening but for something more direct, and they were stored with the particular neatness of people who know exactly what they have and treat it with respect. Sarek stared for a long time without speaking. "We have been watching the border for 8 months, Lena said. Her voice was even and quiet, the same voice she had used at the podium that morning, but without the careful diplomacy. "This was just the truth," said plainly. "We identified a pattern 4 months ago. Something moving along the outer corridor in a way that was not random. Testing edges. Probing. We sent an unmanned probe to get a closer reading and it went silent 6 seconds after it reached the area." She paused. "We logged it and kept watching." "Why did you not report this?" Sarek said. His voice had something in it that was not quite anger. It was something more complicated than anger. "To whom?" Lena said. "We are not members of this council. We have no standing to file a formal threat report. We submitted our petition this morning and you voted against it in under 60 seconds. She looked at him steadily. "You gave us no standing to report anything. So we said nothing. And we kept watching. And we got ready." Sarek turned from the open panel and looked at her. "Ready," he repeated. "The Meridian is not a cargo ship," Lena said simply. "It never was." Hart had not said a word through any of this. He had stood near the entry to the bay with his arms still crossed, listening, watching Sarek with the patient expression of a man who has already made all his decisions and is simply waiting for the talking to finish. Now he uncrossed his arms. He looked at Lena once, a brief look, the kind that carries a full conversation in it. She nodded. Hart turned and walked through the inner door toward the bridge. A moment later the low hum of the Meridian systems changed pitch slightly, deepening, as the ship began its pre-departure sequence. Sarek turned sharply toward the sound. "He is already moving," Sarek said. "Yes," Lena said. "I have not authorized a departure." Lena looked at him calmly. "No," she agreed. "You have not." The hum deepened further. Somewhere above them, through the hull, the docking arm began its release sequence. The feed came through on a small screen in the corner of the war room. Lena had set it up herself, connecting her communicator to the wall display through a cable she had pulled from her coat pocket. The Council's own long-range sensors covered the border corridor, but their resolution was poor at that distance. The feed from Lena's relay was sharper. Cleaner. The relay had been sitting out there for 6 weeks, fixed to a dead rock near the corridor's edge, waiting for exactly this moment. Dora had looked at the relay feed and then looked at Lena and then looked at the feed again and said nothing. The war room was full. Every senior officer on the station had found a reason to be there. They stood in a wide ring around the central table, watching the display, speaking in low voices that slowly went quieter and then stopped altogether as the 3 human ships appeared on the screen. The Meridian came in first. Then the 2 frigates, the Cass and the Drum, sliding in from a holding position 2 hours out where they had been sitting dark and quiet for 6 weeks alongside the relay. They moved into the corridor in a loose formation, not the tight defensive grouping the Council's officers would have used. They were spread wide, each ship giving the others room. Sarek stood at the table. He had not sat since the markers went dark. For a few minutes the corridor looked empty. The 3 ships moved through it slowly, sensors running. Lena watched the feed and kept her breathing even. Hart's voice came through once, very brief, a single word to his crew that the translation system rendered simply as steady. Then the sensors showed something. It did not appear the way a ship appears, as a defined shape moving at a defined speed. It gathered. That was the only word that seemed to fit. It gathered itself out of the dark the way a storm gathers, slowly at first and then all at once, a mass that had no clear edge, no hull, no engine output, no recognizable form. It rolled. It breathed, almost, expanding and contracting at its edges in a slow rhythm that made it look almost alive. Around its outer edge the light bent slightly, pulled inward, the way water bends toward a drain. Several officers in the war room stepped back from the table. One made a sound and covered it with his hand. Dora's 4 hands all pressed flat on the surface at the same time. Sarek did not move. But the color in his face changed. The entity was enormous. Larger than anything Lena had been briefed on, larger than the estimates, larger than the probe data had suggested. The 42 Council warships had gone into that thing and there had been nothing left. No debris. No signal. Nothing. The 3 human ships split. The Cass went left and high, moving fast, cutting across the upper edge of the entity's reach. The Drum went right and low. The Meridian held the center and slowed down, which made every officer in the war room make some kind of sound because slowing down was the last thing anyone expected. Hart was making himself visible. He was making the Meridian the most obvious thing in the corridor, the brightest signal, the loudest presence. He was making it look at him. It worked. The entity shifted toward the center. Toward the Meridian. The pull at its edges increased and the light bent harder and the Meridian's rear sensors would have been showing a gravity reading that should have made every person on that bridge feel sick with fear. Hart did not move away. He moved sideways. Not back. Sideways. Cutting across the face of the thing at an angle that looked completely wrong until Lena understood what he was doing. He was not running. He was measuring. He was finding the edge of the pull, mapping it in real time, learning exactly how far it reached and in which direction it was strongest. The Cass came back across from the left, fast and bright, firing a series of short pulse bursts that were not powerful enough to damage anything that size but were loud enough to pull its attention. The entity shifted again. It was slow to turn. That was important information. Lena filed it away and she could see from the movements of the ships that Hart was filing it away too. For 9 minutes this continued. Bait and shift. Move and measure. The entity reaching and missing, its great dark mass turning slowly each time the ships moved around it. Then the Drum came too close. It happened fast. The frigate had been moving along the lower edge, seeding a field of small devices that Lena's people called anchors, things that disrupted the pull at specific points if enough of them were placed correctly. The drum's pilot pushed the last run a fraction too far. The edge of the pull caught the ship's rear section and the gravity reading spiked and the ship stopped responding to its own engines. 4 seconds. In 4 seconds the crew of 31 ejected. Every single one of them, full pods, clean release, practiced and fast in a way that only comes from having drilled it many times. The pods scattered outward away from the pull. The drum went in. There was no explosion. The ship was simply taken. In the war room no one spoke. The Meridian did not slow down. Lena watched the feed and said nothing and kept her hands still at her sides. Hart brought the Meridian around hard and the Cass matched him, and together they drove at the entity from 2 directions at the same angle, pushing not pulling, using the anchor field the drum had seeded before it was lost. The anchors lit up one by one along the corridor, creating a shape, a channel, a direction. The entity moved. Away. Slowly at first. Then faster. The mass of it rolled and contracted and moved toward the edge of the corridor and then beyond it, into the space past the last marked point on any council map, into the dark between the charts where nothing had a name. Then it was gone. The Meridian and the Cass held position. 11 minutes of silence. The war room did not breathe. Then Hart's voice came through the feed. Quiet, flat, certain. It is not coming back tonight. Recovering our crew now. Sarek sat down. He did not remember deciding to. One moment he was standing and the next he was in a chair and his hands were on the table in front of him and he was looking at the empty corridor on the screen where 42 of his ships had been swallowed and 3 human ships had gone in and 2 had come back. Lena stood beside him. She had not moved from that spot in 22 minutes. Sarek looked up at her. That frigate, he said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Your people. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I am sorry. Lena looked at the feed where the Meridian was already moving toward the scattered pods, already gathering its people back from the dark. They knew what they were doing, she said. Every one of them knew exactly what they were doing. She said it simply, without drama, the way someone states a thing that is completely true and needs nothing added to it. Lena did not sleep that night. She sat in the small observer's room they had given her on the station's 4th level, a plain space with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the dark body of deep space. She kept her communicator on the table in front of her and watched the updates come in one by one. The Meridian had reached the first pod cluster within 40 minutes of Hart's call. The Cass was running a wider sweep of the corridor, collecting the pods that had drifted further out. The count came in slowly. 3 pods. 7. 14. 20. By the early hours of the morning the number had reached 29 and then 31 and Lena let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since the drum went in. All 31. Every one of them. She put her communicator down and looked out the window for a while. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, and even if she had been, this was not the moment for it. There were people out there in recovery pods in the cold dark of the border corridor who had done exactly what they had signed up to do and had come through it and were now being carried home. That was not a thing to cry about. That was a thing to be still about, quietly, in a small room with a window, in the middle of the night. She did not lie down on the bed. She sat in the chair and at some point her eyes closed and she rested without fully sleeping, and when the light through the window shifted from black to the deep blue that passed for dawn on a space station she was already awake and already reaching for her coat. She did not change her clothes. She wore the same coat she had worn to the Grand Hall the morning before, the same practical dark coat she had traveled in, slightly creased now, carrying the long day in its fabric. She did not brush it down or straighten it carefully. She put it on and she left the room. The corridors at that hour were quiet. A few station workers moved along the lower passages. A cleaning unit hummed along one wall. Veen was outside the entrance to the hall's main corridor, which surprised her, because she had not expected anyone to be waiting. He stood very still on his 6 legs, and when he saw her he did not say anything. He simply turned and walked ahead of her, leading the way, which she had not asked for and which she found she did not mind. The grand hall was already full. That surprised her more. She had expected a smaller gathering, a formal session called quickly, a few key representatives. But every tier was occupied. All 11 species, every seat filled, a low murmur of voices moving around the curved walls that went quiet as soon as the main doors opened and she walked in. She felt every eye in the room find her. She walked across the wide open floor in her traveled coat with her hands at her sides, and she did not look at the tiers. She walked to the center podium, the same podium she had stood at less than 24 hours ago, the same surface that came up to her chin, and she stopped and she stood there. She did not take out any notes. She did not adjust the podium. She did not clear her throat or look up at the ceiling or do any of the small things people do when they are gathering themselves to speak. She said nothing at all. The hall was completely silent. Sarek looked at her from his high seat for a long moment. He looked at her coat, creased from the day and the night inside it. He looked at her hands, still at her sides. He looked at her face, which was calm and tired and gave nothing away and asked for nothing either. Then he looked at the council. He did not call for order because the hall was already silent. He did not make a speech or explain his reasoning or refer to the events of the previous day. He was the High Arbiter, and he had governed this council for longer than most of the species in the room had been traveling in space, and he understood that there are moments when words make things smaller rather than larger. I am calling a direct vote, he said. Full membership for humanity, effective immediately. He paused for exactly 1 second. Those in favor. 11 hands. Not 10 and then one more. Not a slow raising as each representative checked what the others were doing. 11 hands from 11 species going up at the same moment, clean and clear, filling the hall with a stillness that was different from the silence before it. No one spoke. No one argued. No one asked for a discussion period or a review committee or a secondary vote. The hands went up and stayed up, and the hall held them there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Sarek stood. He came down from his high seat, which Lena had not seen him do before, and he crossed the wide floor of the grand hall the way a person crosses a space when they have decided something fully and are simply completing the act of it. He was nearly twice her height, and he stopped in front of her and looked down at her for a moment with his pale yellow eyes. Then he lowered his head. Not a small polite tilt. A full lowering, slow and deliberate, the kind that cost something from someone who had never done it before. Welcome to the council, he said. Lena looked up at him. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once, a single quiet nod that carried everything she was not going to say out loud: the 12 minutes at the podium, the rejected vote, the night in the small room counting pods coming home one by one. Then she turned. She walked back across the floor of the grand hall, through the main doors, and into the corridor beyond. She did not look back at the tiers or the raised hands or the high seat or any of it. Veen fell into step beside her quietly. Where are you going? He asked. To the bay, Lena said. Will Hart is bringing his people in, and someone should be there when they dock. She kept walking and her steps were steady and she did not slow down once.